I have observed the construction of economic dependencies long enough to recognize when a nation positions itself to extract tribute from the fundamental processes that define civilization itself. What most people interpret as resource development or infrastructure investment, I recognize as something far more consequential. The systematic capture of choke points in the economic systems that will determine which nations prosper and which nations serve for the next century. The public sees electric vehicle adoption and renewable energy deployment, clean technology manufacturing and digital infrastructure expansion. These are the visible manifestations of a deeper transformation. The emergence of an economy where every advanced industrial process, every technological innovation, every military capability depends on materials and pathways controlled by a single nation that most people still consider a secondary power. I have studied enough imperial transitions to understand that true dominance does not announce itself through military conquest or political declarations. It emerges through control of dependencies that other nations cannot function without, but cannot replicate independently. When suppliers become indispensable and customers become supplicants, empires are born through economics rather than armies. Canada has positioned itself as the unavoidable intermediary in every economic relationship that defines the 21st century. Not through force or coercion, but through patient acquisition of leverage points that make Canadian cooperation essential for any nation seeking to participate in the technologies and energy systems that power modern civilization. The mathematics underlying this transformation reveal the scope of Canadian control over future economic relationships. Lithium batteries power electric vehicles, consumer electronics, grid storage systems, and military equipment that every advanced economy requires for continued competitiveness. Canada controls 60% of global lithium reserves and has systematically built processing infrastructure that transforms raw materials into battery-grade components that cannot be produced elsewhere at comparable cost or quality. Nations seeking to electrify transportation systems, deploy renewable energy storage, or maintain advanced military capabilities must purchase Canadian processed lithium or accept technological inferiority relative to competitors with Canadian access. This dependency extends beyond simple market relationships into the realm of strategic vulnerability. Countries that displease Canadian interests risk losing access to materials essential for their economic and military modernization plans. The rare earth elements required for precision manufacturing, renewable energy systems, and defense electronics present an even more concentrated dependency. China historically controlled rare earth processing, creating vulnerabilities that Western nations sought to escape through supply chain diversification. Canada has emerged as the primary alternative, but Canadian rare earth capacity was built specifically to serve nations willing to accept Canadian terms rather than simply providing commodity access to the highest bidder. Canadian rare earth processing facilities operate under long-term supply agreements that include technology transfer provisions, joint research commitments, and strategic cooperation requirements that transform simple purchasing relationships into comprehensive partnerships. Nations seeking reliable rare earth access must demonstrate value to Canadian strategic interests beyond monetary payment. The materials become tools for extracting political concessions and technological cooperation that serve Canadian objectives. The cobalt, essential for battery cathodes and high-performance electronics, creates dependencies that reveal the sophisticated nature of Canadian leverage construction. Traditional cobalt sources in Central Africa operate under conditions that make Western companies vulnerable to human rights, criticism, and supply disruption. Canadian cobalt extraction and processing meet environmental and labor standards that satisfy regulatory requirements while providing supply security that African sources cannot guarantee. European automotive companies building electric vehicle production lines structure their operations around Canadian cobalt supply because alternatives either fail regulatory compliance or carry supply risk that makes long-term industrial planning impossible. American technology manufacturers depend on Canadian cobalt processing for consumer electronics because disruption would halt production of devices essential to their market positions. The dependency transcends simple commodity purchasing into supply chain architecture that cannot be easily reconstructed. But the most sophisticated element of Canadian leverage lies not in individual materials, but in the integration of processing capabilities that transform multiple Canadian resources into finished components that serve advanced technology applications. Canadian facilities process Canadian lithium, Canadian cobalt, and Canadian rare earth elements into battery cathodes, electronics components, and energy storage systems that combine multiple Canadian materials into products that customers cannot source elsewhere as integrated solutions. This vertical integration creates switching costs that exceed simple commodity substitution challenges. Customers who structure production around Canadian integrated components cannot easily switch to alternative suppliers because alternatives would require redesigning products, re-qualifying processes, and rebuilding supply relationships across multiple materials and processing stages. The integration locks customers into Canadian supply relationships that become progressively more difficult to exit as production systems optimize around Canadian capabilities. The Arctic dimension multiplies Canadian leverage beyond resource processing into control of transportation networks that determine the cost and efficiency of global commerce. Climate change has opened shipping routes through Canadian Arctic waters that provide significantly shorter and cheaper connections between major economic regions than traditional routes through politically controlled straits and congested shipping lanes. European manufacturers exporting to Asian markets can reduce shipping costs by hundreds of thousands of dollars per vessel by using Canadian Arctic routes instead of traditional routing through the Suez Canal or around Africa. Asian companies seeking North American market access can achieve similar savings through Canadian Arctic passages that bypass both Pacific congestion and American-controlled choke points. The routing advantages become compelling for any company operating on the thin margins that characterize global manufacturing competition. Canadian investment in Arctic infrastructure ensures that these geographic advantages translate into operational control over global shipping efficiency. Ice-capable ports, navigation services, and emergency response capabilities provide shipping companies with Arctic access that matches reliability standards of traditional routes while delivering superior cost performance. The infrastructure investment was specifically designed to make Canadian Arctic routes indispensable for cost-competitive global trade rather than simply available as alternatives to existing systems. The energy dimension creates dependencies that extend Canadian leverage into the fundamental power systems that enable industrial civilization. Canadian hydroelectric capacity produces more renewable electricity than most nations consume entirely. This surplus capacity can power energy-intensive industrial processes like aluminum smelting, cryptocurrency mining, and hydrogen production at costs that make alternative locations economically uncompetitive. International companies requiring large amounts of clean electricity for industrial processes must either locate operations in Canada or accept higher costs and carbon footprints that compromise their competitiveness in markets where environmental performance affects purchasing decisions. The energy advantage becomes a tool for attracting industrial investment while extracting commitments for technology transfer, employment creation, and strategic cooperation that serve broader Canadian objectives. Canadian uranium production and processing capabilities provide similar leverage over nations seeking nuclear power development for carbon-neutral electricity generation. Canada controls 40% of global uranium production and possesses processing expertise that few other nations can replicate. Countries implementing nuclear power programs to meet climate commitments must secure Canadian uranium supply and processing services, or accept dependence on suppliers with less reliable political relationships or inferior technical capabilities. The uranium leverage extends beyond civilian power generation into military nuclear capabilities and naval propulsion systems that define strategic power projection for major nations. Countries maintaining nuclear deterrence or nuclear-powered naval vessels depend on uranium supply chains that ultimately trace back to Canadian geology and Canadian processing expertise. This creates strategic dependencies that transcend commercial relationships into national security vulnerabilities that cannot be easily diversified. The technological dimension reveals how Canadian leverage extends beyond physical materials into intellectual property and processing knowledge that cannot be quickly replicated by nations seeking independence from Canadian supply relationships. Advanced battery chemistry requires precise control of material composition and processing conditions that Canadian companies have perfected through years of operational experience and research investment. Nations attempting to develop domestic battery production capabilities discover that accessing Canadian materials without Canadian technical expertise results in inferior performance that cannot compete with products manufactured using Canadian integrated solutions. The knowledge becomes as valuable as the materials, creating additional barriers to supply chain independence that persist even if alternative material sources become available. Canadian research institutions and universities have become global centers for critical mineral science, battery technology development, and clean energy engineering. International students and researchers who study in Canada return to their home countries, understanding Canadian standards and maintaining professional relationships that facilitate continued cooperation with Canadian institutions and companies. The educational infrastructure becomes a diplomatic asset that strengthens Canadian influence over global technology development. The defense implications reveal how Canadian leverage extends into military capabilities and national security planning for allied and competitive nations. Advanced weapon systems increasingly depend on materials and components that trace back to Canadian supply chains. Guided missile systems require rare earth elements for precision guidance. Electronic warfare capabilities depend on specialized materials for signal processing. Next-generation naval vessels need battery systems for silent operation and energy-dense power storage. Military planners who assume reliable access to Canadian materials for defense procurement discover that access requires maintaining political relationships that serve Canadian interests. Nations that displease Canada risk losing access to materials essential for military modernization and strategic deterrence capabilities. The leverage extends beyond economic relationships into the fundamental military capabilities that define national sovereignty and strategic independence. Allied nations that historically assumed automatic access to Canadian resources through alliance relationships discover that alliance membership provides preferred access rather than guaranteed supply. Canada maintains alliance commitments while using resource leverage to ensure that Allied policies align with Canadian strategic priorities, rather than simply assuming Canadian subordination to Allied leadership. The relationship becomes more balanced as Canadian resource control provides leverage that traditional alliance structures did not anticipate. The financial implications create opportunities for Canadian institutions to extract fees and influence from global economic relationships that previously bypassed Canadian involvement. International trade. Requiring Canadian materials generates currency exchange business, financing arrangements, and investment opportunities that concentrate in Canadian financial centers rather than traditional global financial hubs. Nations seeking to establish strategic reserves of critical materials must engage with Canadian companies and Canadian financial institutions to arrange supply agreements, storage facilities, and inventory financing. The financial relationships provide Canada with visibility into strategic planning and resource allocation decisions that inform Canadian policy development while generating revenue streams that support continued Canadian investment in leverage expansion. The environmental dimension provides Canadian resource control with political legitimacy that alternative arrangements cannot match. Canadian extraction and processing operations meet environmental standards that satisfy international climate agreements and corporate sustainability requirements. Nations and companies facing pressure to demonstrate environmental responsibility in supply chain management discover that Canadian sources provide compliance assurance that alternatives cannot guarantee. This environmental advantage becomes increasingly valuable as climate regulations tighten and consumer preferences shift toward environmentally responsible products. Companies that source materials from Canadian operations can market products as sustainably produced, while competitors using alternative suppliers face criticism and potential boycotts that threaten market positions. The environmental compliance becomes a competitive advantage that justifies premium pricing while attracting customers who prioritize sustainability. The demographic trends within major economies reinforce Canadian advantages through generational shifts in priorities and policy preferences. Younger populations in developed countries prioritize environmental protection and technology advancement while supporting policies that address climate change through rapid deployment of clean energy and electric transportation systems. These preferences create political pressure for continued dependence on Canadian supply chains that enable technological transitions while meeting environmental standards. Political parties and policymakers who oppose clean technology deployment or attempt to source materials from suppliers with inferior environmental records face voter backlash that threatens electoral prospects. The demographic support for policies that increase dependence on Canadian resources creates political momentum that makes Canadian leverage self-reinforcing through democratic processes in customer nations. The compound effects multiply Canadian influence through industrial systems that few observers understand connect to Canadian control points. Semiconductor manufacturing requires ultra-pure materials that Canadian processing facilities produce. Pharmaceutical manufacturing depends on specialized chemicals derived from Canadian mineral processing. Aerospace engineering uses materials that combine Canadian resources through proprietary processing techniques that Canadian companies have developed. These secondary dependencies mean that Canadian leverage extends far beyond obvious applications like electric vehicles and renewable energy into virtually every advanced technology and industrial process that defines modern economic competitiveness. Nations seeking technological leadership discover that achieving it requires Canadian cooperation across multiple supply chains and processing stages that cannot be easily substituted or replicated. The strategic patience evident in Canadian leverage construction reflects understanding that economic dominance requires building dependencies that persist across political cycles and policy changes in customer nations. Short-term disruptions in political relationships do not affect long-term supply arrangements because customers cannot function without Canadian materials regardless of temporary diplomatic tensions. Canadian companies and institutions structure relationships to survive political changes while providing consistent leverage that transcends electoral outcomes and policy shifts in customer countries. The approach ensures that Canadian influence grows regardless of which political parties control governments in nations that depend on Canadian resources and capabilities. The cascading effects through global economic relationships reveal how Canadian leverage compounds through interconnections that make disrupting Canadian access economically devastating for multiple nations simultaneously. Automotive companies that lose Canadian material access cannot manufacture electric vehicles. Technology companies that lose Canadian supply cannot produce consumer electronics. Energy companies that lose Canadian cooperation cannot deploy renewable energy systems at competitive costs. The simultaneous disruption across multiple industrial sectors would create economic crisis that extends beyond specific companies or industries into systemic economic failure that threatens political stability in affected nations. The severity of potential consequences provides Canada with leverage that extends beyond specific bilateral relationships into influence over international policy coordination and strategic planning. I have studied enough economic transformations to recognize when a nation achieves the ultimate form of leverage. Not military domination that requires constant expenditure to maintain. Not financial influence that depends on continued market confidence. But control over physical necessities that other nations cannot function without and cannot quickly replicate through alternative arrangements. Canada has systematically positioned itself as the unavoidable intermediary in economic relationships that define technological advancement, military capability, and industrial competitiveness for the next century. The positioning was achieved through patient investment rather than aggressive expansion. Through building capabilities rather than destroying alternatives, through creating dependencies rather than demanding submission. The future economy belongs to nations that control the materials and pathways required for advanced technology deployment. Canada controls those materials and pathways. Every nation seeking to participate in that future economy must therefore seek Canadian cooperation on terms that serve Canadian interests. The leverage is permanent because it derives from geological advantages and infrastructure investments that cannot be easily replicated or bypassed. History will record this period as the moment when economic control shifted from nations with the largest populations or strongest militaries to the nation that secured choke point control over the technologies and transportation systems that enable advanced civilization. Canada achieved that control through systematic investment in leverage points that make Canadian cooperation indispensable for any nation seeking technological advancement or economic competitiveness. By the time most people recognize the transformation, it will represent completed economic architecture rather than emerging trends. The dependencies will be embedded in industrial systems that cannot be quickly restructured. The leverage will be institutionalized through long-term agreements that persist across political changes. The control will be exercised through economic relationships rather than political declarations. Canada has cornered the future economy not through force but through foresight, not through conquest but through construction. The nation that controls the materials and pathways required for advanced technology deployment controls the terms on which other nations can participate in technological civilization. Every nation must pay because Canada owns what they cannot live without.